Hello and welcome to another episode of It's All Interesting. And joining me today is Logan Phillips from racetothewhitehouse.com, racetothewh.com. If you follow Logan on Twitter or X and you're on his bio, all the links are there. He is really an incredible resource data driven prognosticator. We'll get into all of that. Logan has a phenomenal track record, folks. In 2022, based on his modeling, he predicted the GOP would win just about 223 seats in the House, and they ended up winning 222. Logan, thank you so much for coming on. How are you today?
Hey, I'm doing great, Clifford. Thanks for the nice invitation. I think, or the nice intro. I think 2024 is the year we find out if I'm lucky or good.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know before we came on, you were telling me about all the really cool work you did before you joined Race to the White House. So tell us everything.
Yeah, I've been working in politics since I graduated college. I was interning for President Obama, working on a schedule coming out. I did some work on Clinton's campaign. I had some lobbying for affordable housing afterwards. But yeah, I went to study international affairs at Columbia, but like politics still had its like claws in me. I had this presidential campaign management class where I didn't have to do this, but part of the assignment we had to build a fake campaign plan for Biden in the primary, right? And I just wanted to know where the polls actually were, so I built a polling average. I kept finding like questions I wanted to answer and decided to teach myself how to figure them out. I built an election forecast because look, I was at Columbia, which is not exactly where you get your finger on the pulse of the American people. So I just wanted the answers, and I didn't want to wait till August 2020 for Nate Silver to tell me what was going on. So I kept doing pretty well in the primaries and doing a little better than Silver's forecast then. And so once the pandemic hit, I just put all my heart and soul into it and made a business out of it. And now I run Race to the White House, and we forecast elections for the president, for the House, for the Senate, for governor, and we track all the polling.
All right. Well, we're going to get into all that. Thanks again. Great to have you here. And we're definitely going to talk about Silver's forecast because I know there's a lot of machination about that going on Twitter. So glad we get to do this post debate. I know we were originally supposed to speak on Monday, but here we are now. What'd you make of the debate last night?
I think it was a great performance by Kamala Harris. In terms of like what we can take away from it, I think we got to set the backdrop first, right? Voters were coming into this debate having, for the most part, since Harris became the nominee, doing something rare. They were giving her the benefit of the doubt. Hardly usual in our era of cynical politics, but so many voters, especially swing voters, badly wanted a new option, and they had it. And we saw her really rise in the polls from being the underdog to become, the modest favorite. A position that slipped a little bit in the last week, lost about a half point nationally, stayed relatively strong in the state polls. But, there's early signs of dipping, which happens. These elections are going to go back and forth. But still, coming into this debate, I think what Harris really needed to do, more so than attacking Trump, was establish herself because swing voters, most of them, they have a pretty set opinion on Donald Trump. Maybe it wavers up and down a little, but it's mostly set, which of course it would be, right? This guy has been around in politics for a longer period of time on the national level than anyone since Nixon or maybe FDR, right? So you don't usually run three times in a row. But Harris, they don't know yet, right? People are liking what they're seeing overall, on average, right? I know folks who don't might be upset with that, but if you look at the overall percentage, right, it's slightly more favorable. It's basically tied favorable, unfavorable, roughly. So maybe I'm exaggerating a little. It's just so unusual for that to happen that it feels like it's positive because we're used to everyone being so negative. So, you know, but her polling's still pretty close, like a 2.8% lead, despite a huge gap in the favorability. And so I think there are a lot of voters out there that are like, yeah, I kind of like what I see, but I need to see more. I want to see if she can handle the responsibility of the presidency. I want to see what she's fighting for, and I want to see if I believe that she can get it done. So they're looking for values, and they're looking for ability to get it done. And so I think this debate was all about Kamala Harris more than it was about Donald Trump. And so while Donald Trump had a really bad debate, I don't know how much that's going to hurt him indirectly.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Do you, based on what you just said, that it's more about Harris and less about Trump? He did not have a good performance, I think, by any metric. Any reasonable person watching that can tell that he did not have a good performance. He was relitigating things from 30 years ago. Does that hurt him? Because he's kind of just sometimes, this is like the greatest hits of Donald Trump over and over and over again. Do you find that it'll hurt him, or is it really just this could be in a position to help her from last night?
Yeah, well, I mean, it depends how you answer, right? Like politics is a zero-sum game, so anything that when it comes to presidential elections, so anything that helps Harris hurts him. But in terms of his supporters, yeah, I think it hurts a little, not much. And by supporters, I don't mean deep supporters, obviously. I mean like the ones who are a little on the wavering, because it reminded people, I imagine, of the traits that they don't like about Donald Trump. A lot of chaos, a lot of me. But there was nothing shocking there. Like it might have been a weaker version of Donald Trump, but there's nothing shocking. He talks about himself all the time. He says some wild stuff. People who just are tired of the status quo, that's what they like. Now, I don't know if they like the specifics. They might find it a little much, but like they like that he's like completely different from every other president we've had. But I think for voters that wanted to see something from Harris, boy, Harris came out strong. And Trump was, this is where Trump's inability to perform in this debate really hurts him. He did not land hits. He did not land hits. And that's what he needed to do because Harris is going to do some good things to establish herself. But the question was, could Trump tear her down? Could he make her own the parts of the Biden administration people don't like? And really what it means is owning the present because it's not that people are like, oh, these specific policies I dislike. It's really about how they don't feel satisfied with where things are in America and they're not thrilled with Donald Trump. And so that is what is close, makes the election so close, right? The status quo versus a guy they don't view as a great alternative that they've already had before. And Harris was able to present herself as someone that would move things forward in a new direction, regardless of how new it's going to be. That's kind of the vibe you got, right? And she seemed capable and able to handle the big challenges that come with the presidency in this debate. So I think it was a help for her. I honestly, what do you think before I move on?
Let me ask. Let me just ask you this. So you brought something up that she was able to, and he was not able to land any punches in terms of getting to the point where tying her necessarily to the current administration. How do you think? And I think it's been a brilliant campaign strategy by her. How do you think that so far, effectively, she has been able really to campaign on the premise that she's not tied to Joe Biden? How do you think that she has been able to do that? Because it seems like she's been able to do that pretty effectively.
Within the realm of what she can do. I mean, she's his vice
Of
president.
course.
She's made the strategic choice, which I think is probably a good one, to not kind of do what Al Gore did and run away from Clinton. Uh, in 2000. I know I'm going real back. I was like 7, so it's not from memory. This is from reading.
We've read about it, though. We've read about
Yeah, I wasn't that smart of a 7-year-old. Unfortunately, for my mental health as a kid, I was not that obsessed with politics as I am now.
it.
So he, and there's a reason to not do that, which is more so, in my view. First, you got to run as you are, and I don't think Harris is that cutthroat. Second, what does that say to the voters about you? You might try to sell a message that I'm completely different, but A, are they going to believe it? And B, they're going to view you as cutthroat and mean if you really
Mm.
turn it up and disloyal.
Well, I think the big question that people have from last night, and I know we're still just dealing with the fallout, the immediacy, will it move the needle, right? Because you have the Harris camp and her voters, you have the Trump camp and his voters, and we're probably looking at, I don't know, maybe 10 to 20%, even if that much, but over the course of 7 swing states, is it going to move the needle with those voters that are going to decide the election?
Well, I haven't looked at the data on the swing state level yet, but I built this polling average, which I got some assists by 538, right? Because when I was building my presidential forecast, I needed polls from the 60s to 2020 so I could see where things were at each day, so I could test my forecast in the past, right? So that's kind of a cool thing to have, right? Like I built it in a way the data is pretty easy to work with, so I can see like what did major events in each election cycle change how the electorate felt. The CNN exit poll showed that Harris I mean, the snap poll after the debate showed
Yes.
that voters thought Harris won 63 to 37%. And based off of elections since 2004, that would suggest she'd be on track to gain 2.3% in the popular vote, which would put her to just over 5% lead on the polling average. Now, will that happen or not? Of course, there's going to be a lot of variance there. The stuff isn't perfect. The electorate's more polarized, but she definitely had a dominant debate. And on average, that does lead to gains. And that included in recent elections. Even the debate we had earlier this cycle I included in there. This is sort of like the secondary first debate, so it's a little hard how to frame this exactly. And this type of system on average has been off by about 0.8% in either direction in terms of predicting what the gap is. So it's imperfect, but it's definitely shown. Like we definitely see the person that wins the debate gains, and it's a question of how much, right? So yeah, she was coming into this leading, and odds are that she will now have a bigger lead. Now that doesn't mean she's going to keep her lead. A lot can change in politics. There may even be future debates. We'll see. But today, yeah, I think she came in as slight favorite, and now she's a little more than that.
I was surprised last night that I read the report saying that her campaign wanted to do another debate so immediately after last night's performance. If I was the Harris campaign, I would be looking at this saying, all right, we just had a great night. That seems to be the general consensus. Let's just take it, bank it, and run. Why would her campaign want to get on the stage again?
Yeah, that's a tough call to make. I think they must be convinced that Trump can't bring it. He'll probably do better next time, but I think they're convinced that he can't bring it, that it was that strong. Um,
Hmm.
and it will give them a consistent news cycles that could be positive. Trump has historically done better in the second debate.
So as of now, well, let before we get into that, tell us about your modeling. What do you base your modeling on, your forecasting on? I know you go through everything. You go through national, Senate, House races, and gubernatorial races. So tell us how you do your modeling to the extent you to the extent you want to share your proprietary information.
I like putting it all on the table. I'm not gonna give you the very specific numbers to the digit, but like I don't mind talking about my philosophy, especially because I'm newer on the block, right? This is my third election cycle, second doing it full time, so I feel like some more honesty and openness is required to establish trust. So happy to talk about it. So here's the broad overview, right? I try to do things that are backed by history and data. I take kind of like the scientific method approach. I have a theory, I test it relentlessly on the past, and I see if it's predictive. And so oh my God, does it make these forecasts take forever to build? But I went back to the 60s. I actually went back to the 1800s for some of this stuff because that's the last time we had an incumbent president run again. We lost Grover Cleveland. And
Mm-hmm.
I went through all the economic data to see what type of economic indicators are most predictive of the future and how can I translate that into a popular vote. I did the same thing, figure out how accurate polling would be at different stages of the election. And, broadly speaking, on the presidential level, I know that's the one people are most into this time for obvious reasons. Like the broad philosophy is I have two parts, right? I have the state level. I have to, and I have, okay, let's back up a little bit. Sorry. So first I figure out what the national polling is going to be, right? I project like what the popular vote is going to be. That's coming from polling. That's coming from special elections. It's coming just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit from fundraising, like 1% of it. And it's coming from special elections because that's the one signal we have where voters are actually telling us what they want, and you see how much better Democrats or Republicans are doing than we'd expect. Based
And right now, the Democrats have basically been destroying, for lack of a better term, the Republicans at special
I
elections.
wouldn't go as far as that. I would say they've been winning. I think by about 7%. About it was just a 7% national environment edge, which is very meaningful. But again, given this is just one meaningful but minor piece of the popular vote, like they've had years like 2018, like it was just insane, right? How good they were doing
Mm-hmm.
there. But that's still really good. It's still really good. Um, And then, I use that on the state level because on the state level, I'm doing two things. One, I'm taking the state polling, and that becomes more impactful every day we get closer to the election based off the quality of the polls for each state. And then I also look at, okay, based off how I think the nation's going to vote, how much is this state to the left of the or right of how the nation votes? And those two combined, like one's the fundamental side, the other's the polling, will give me an overall projection for the lead for each state for Trump and Harris.
And when you talk about quality of the polls, what metrics are you looking at to determine, I guess, what the quality is of a poll? What would give you the confidence in a New York Times poll versus confidence in a Trafalgar poll or an Emerson poll?
Yeah, the latter two I have a lot more confidence in. The Trafalgar polls, I always worry if I'm doing the right thing, even including them, because they've been so wild. But I mean, they're pretty good in 16 and 20. I think that's more that they're very R biased, and the whole field was so off, so they got it right. 2022, the Vermont poll is off by like 20 plus points, and they just don't seem to have a really good methodology. So but I do include them. It takes a lot for me not to include a pollster. Anyway, to get more.
It, what causes? And I spoke with David D. Chapman the other day, who does a lot of analysis on polling as well. What causes these wild swings in polls? And I will ask you the same question that I asked him. I remember in 2020 there was a poll that came out about a week before the election that had Joe Biden up by 18 points in Wisconsin,
Oh, that was a horrible poll. God.
right? So, and then the election, obviously it was within a point basically. So what causes those wild swings and what causes that just total disparity from the reality of that's on the ground to getting a poll like that? And I think there was a poll a couple of weeks ago that, or maybe last week, that had Harris up 8 in Wisconsin, but all the other polling shows the races within 2 or 3 points.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the 18 point is it was from a great pollsters. It was very surprising, and I think they knew and even talked about how this is like almost certainly wrong. But they, from an integrity standpoint, felt we did the process and we have to post it. Some pollsters, when they have a poll like that, they don't put it out. Um, I can't tell
And I
you
know everybody
what
loves to
happened.
nitpick that specific poll, but it's just a good example to show. And so many of the polls in 2020 did not bake in those Trump numbers that were much higher than what the forecasts were.
Yeah, I like thinking about it in the broad spectrum of the polling average, right? And even in then, Wisconsin was way off. That's going back to like the 60s. I think that might have been the biggest miss of any state where I had high quality polling based off of what the polling would suggest, right? Um, and the reality is the pollsters are trying to solve a really hard problem. They're trying to understand how the electorate's going to vote, what the electorate's going to look like so that they can measure that electorate properly. And they're doing it from moving target because American politics is changing like crazy. The demographic pairings for different parties has changed dramatically since 2008. It's changed quite a bit since 2016. And 2000 is barely even recognizable, right? So look at the electoral map in 2000, and like you can't even believe some of this.
You look at the electoral map from 1992, from Bill Clinton's victory. He took a bunch of southern states and I think expanded his map in '96, and it's like a foreign concept as to what it would look like today.
Yeah, and you got states like Tennessee as swing states, California, New York in like the 80s as swing states, right? So things change a lot. And pollsters were trying to figure that out at a time where response rates by phone have plummeted. And think about it, right? It makes sense. If you're someone that's extroverted like me, a younger Gen Z side will find this insane that anyone would be like this. But I kind of like when someone calls me, I'll pick it up. And now I don't do that so much because usually it is a scammer, or someone from China, or a robocall, and it's not even someone trying to sell me, which is annoying, but I can be polite. It's like this is just someone trying to trick me into something, and so of course people are going to answer their phones less. And so they're getting a lot of their polls from online now, and some from text polls, but it's just a really hard problem to find a way to reach people when they're not responding as much. And then the second problem is, let's look at 2020 specifically. There's some elections that are way harder to forecast. And I didn't do this. It was my first year. I like to think I'd figure this out now, but I was juggling a lot. I don't think I had my head fully on it because I was still learning the tools of the trade back then. But what we all should have done is seen there's so much more reasons for this race to go wrong than normal that you got to increase bigger error margins, right? Like you have your projections and you have your chance to win for each state and your overall, like how often can things go wrong. That gets your probability up. So if you think there's a high chance for things to go wrong, you have a bigger chance of upset, even if the same projected lead by state, right? So my view is in 2020, because everyone was home, or a lot of people were home, not everyone, Democrats are more home. Okay, there's a bigger risk of polling misses there. And uh, these days, I think after two historic polling misses in the presidential, we don't know if it's going to miss either way. Pollsters could easily overcompensate for their mistakes last time, but we should just assume there's a bigger risk of a polling miss. That's all in my models, right? I'm always going to have a higher chance of an upset as a result until we see a long record of polling accuracy again.
So as of now, and I know we're fresh off the debate. As of now, where do you see the race?
My forecast has Harris at a 55% chance. It's very hard to translate the debate into that off the cuff, but I'll say 60% chance, I guess. I mean, that's not a data driven one, right? It's clearly that the debate will change the odds. I honestly think that's pretty conservative, though, because
How much, based on what you know, and if you don't know the answer, that's fine. How much do you know in terms of what goes into the predicted or poly market on the betting odds, right? Because last night during the debate, Trump's numbers went down in the betting market, and then this morning they were back up a little bit. So, what data are they using in the betting markets to drive their numbers?
I don't really trust the betting markets unless there's consensus. When there's a 95% chance Harris won the debate, it's like, okay, this is over. If you got to have consensus among Dems and Republicans investing money for that.
Right.
Betting markets are a representation of what the people who disproportionately like to bet in politics think. And we saw that in 2022, where it's not so great, right? There was starting to be a thinking in 2020 and 2016, okay, maybe this is a good way to predict what's going to happen. Well, I think what we saw is, one, they're always going to be closer to the center than the forecasters will be in an election that doesn't look super close, because they're going to be, I think it's Republican skewed, but there's more of a balance. Um, so if the polls are going to miss towards the center, you're probably going to be more right. Second, they're also going to miss to the right in general as well, right? So if it's a Republican leaning group, the polls miss in favor of Dems, yeah, they're going to miss. And then and they're going to be better. And when it's the opposite and they miss in favor of Dems, they're going to be off by a lot, right? Which is what the case was in 2022. So maybe if we have 4 more cycles and they end up being more accurate across the board, then I'll take it more seriously. But right now, I think it's interesting. I think it tells us something about how these types of folks are thinking. But I wouldn't put I wouldn't put I don't put money in politics, but if I were, like, I wouldn't trust them to decide how to do it, which I guess means it's
Well,
a
you
way to make
mentioned
money.
that's for sure. You mentioned Nate Silver's model before. I know there's a bunch of models that are floating around in the Twitter space. Yours is one of them. I know Silver's model has Trump in a clear electoral college victory. What's your case that Harris is truly in the driver's seat, and what is different from what you're looking at versus what Silver is looking at? Because I know Silver stuff really gets put out there on Twitter.
Yeah, Silver has a good media consulting team, and he knows how to get some attention, and he has a good track record. So hey, more power to him. But I wouldn't argue that Kamala Harris is in the driver's seat. I would argue she is modestly favored in one of the most competitive election cycles we've seen. And the reason I would say that is because
It just doesn't sound as sexy, right?
it's not sexy, but it's the truth. She has gained so much that it feels like she is way ahead in a way, but she's not. It's very competitive. And part of the reason why it's so competitive, and I suspect this is why Nate shows Trump ahead, is the national polling. If all you knew were the national polls and you knew what happened in the last few election cycles, and you knew the economy, you'd think Trump was favored. And that's because Trump had a huge advantage in the Electoral College in 2020, and a pretty significant advantage in 2016 as well, enough that he won. It was even bigger in 20. Now, Democrats clearly have an assignment after that, right? Biden did, Harris does now. Shrink that advantage. And I think that they have operationally been successful in that. Maybe there's been a few more factories from infrastructure bills in Arizona and Michigan than there would have been otherwise. They've certainly been messaging with those places in mind every day. And the state polling is much better in those key states than the national polling would suggest. So, North Carolina, she's now slightly ahead in the polls there.
Do you believe? So I've spoken to people. I spoke to Chapman the other day. He doesn't believe it. He does not believe that she's ahead in North Carolina. He doesn't. He said that he doesn't believe that North Carolina is truly a swing state. And we've seen cycles. Trump's won North Carolina twice. He won in 16. He won in 20. Um, small victories, but victories nonetheless. Do you believe that in a state like North Carolina, that Harris is truly ahead? And I ask that from the standpoint of, over the last 2 cycles, there have been Trump support that have not been baked into the polls, that there is a quote unquote hidden Trump vote. Do you believe that something like that is still out there? Or do you think pollsters, I know you touched on this a little, do you think pollsters have figured that out, or we just don't know yet?
You got the last one, I think, personally. We don't know. It's a viable possibility. It goes either way. Look, if you come into the assumption that Republicans are going to be underrated, Real Clear Politics did that. They chose to not include some polls in their average very clearly. And then on top of that, they had here's what we think is actually going to happen because the polls are going to miss by the same as much as 2020. And they got like 7 or 8 Senate races wrong doing that, right? And if you did in the other direction, 2020, oh my God, would that be embarrassing? If you're like, oh, hey, in 2018, I don't know what the miss was then, but if you're like assuming it'll miss by like 0.3 to Dems, and you'd be like, you'd be even more off, right? So we don't know. Pollsters have worked very hard to do this. They have a clear economic incentive to not miss the same way again. This is capitalism, right? Their goal is to make money. If they have another egg on their face 3 times in a row, boy, that's not good for the industry at all. So you have that as a reason to think they may underrate Harris. You have the track record of the last two to say the opposite. And we have electoral history that shows past misses aren't predictive of the directional misses of the next race. So
Hmm.
now, when it comes to North Carolina, with all respect to your past guess, the Trump administration, Trump campaign clearly disagrees with him, as does the Harris campaign. They're investing an enormous amount of money, and everyone in North Carolina politics thinks it's a competitive swing state. Now, is it possible he ends up surging ahead and there's a big polling miss particularly powerful in North Carolina? Sure, but like that's not over 50% chance. It's just a possibility. And that's what it would take for him to be right that it's not a swing state. It's definitely odds are very high. It's a swing state based off the information we have now. Now, is she winning there? I can't tell you that for sure. She's up in the
Right.
polls. My model gives her a 45% chance there because I'm also considering the fundamentals part, right? Hyper competitive, the most competitive race in my forecast, slightly more than Pennsylvania. So, both parties can easily win it.
Well, we're going to get to Pennsylvania, but you just mentioned something which piqued my mind. You mentioned that obviously that Trump campaign would disagree with that since they're spending money there. Interestingly, Harris is now spending money and making campaign stops in New Hampshire. Is that a state that is in play, or is that something she's just trying to button up?
Yeah, here's what I would say, right? You win Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. Oh, wow. I don't know what I just said, but that was not. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. You think the job is over. Job's not over, right? You got to hold your margin in the states that you're expected to win, but are not locked in 100%. That's New
Yeah,
Hampshire. That's Virginia. That's New Mexico. Kind of, I won't even include Colorado in there because the state just
those
isn't
are the
real.
three that I actually had listed that I was going to ask you about. You know what? Let's take a pause on that. So let me first ask you about the seventh swing. So I look at Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, Nevada, North Carolina. Out of those seven, which I think you would agree, those are the seven swings. Which are you keeping your eye on the most?
Oh boy, man, I literally am keeping my eye on all of them, and I know it's a cop out, but uh, I
All right,
I'm gonna give
let's
you an
take,
answer on
let's take
that though that's substantive, and I'll tell you why.
well,
I
yeah.
think this Pennsylvania or bust narrative needs to be busted. It is the most important swing state. It is far from the only way Harris can win. And here's how these things work, right? Because we always going in with this narrative every cycle and always ends up being wrong in some way. Like Georgia being to the left of Florida and North Carolina, unexpected but possible. This happens literally every cycle, right? I got the data to prove it. There are always going to be states that move in a directional trajectory different than what the narrative would suggest. And we like to simplify it. We like easy answers, but the reality is these states can move in different directions. And what you really want to look at, what states are a little more similar to each other and more likely to move together, even if the exact direction is hard to say. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, they've been moving together a lot. I mean, boy, in 2016, they certainly did. And that's been true other cycles as well. So if she overperforms and if she, does just well enough to barely win Michigan and Wisconsin, probably loses Pennsylvania if the polling is right in those states in terms of like how close they are. She's not done. She could overperform in the Southeast. She could do really well with white college educated voters and black voters and power through North Carolina. Heck, she could lose Michigan and win Georgia and North Carolina and get to victory. I forget off the cuff if that requires Nevada or not, but it's a state that's a little more favorable for her than Pennsylvania as well. So there's all these different avenues and combinations that can get her or Donald Trump victory.
I
So
was just going to say that because I think there has been so much focus on Pennsylvania, and of course it is a major swing state. Both of them, as much as the media doesn't necessarily want to talk about it, both of them have multiple paths
yeah,
to victory. She has a path through the Sun Belt, plus one of the Great Lakes states, plus Pennsylvania. He has a similar path. If he is somehow able to pick off Arizona, Nevada, and then he keeps North Carolina, he only needs one of those Rust Belt industrial
yes.
states. So both of them, I believe, have very viable, different, multiple paths to win the election.
Yeah, 100%. And if she completely falls apart in the Southwest, like, can New Mexico be in play? It's not likely. We're talking less than 10% chance. But you don't want to be the fool that's saying, I didn't even think about it. It's also like, I mean, campaigns do have limited money. So New Hampshire is an easier one to invest in. And there's scenarios where those three electoral votes can easily make the difference. So it's kind of an easy one to do it. It's a compact market. They're not spending a lot there, right? They're doing a few stops, but it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt.
Well, you mentioned Virginia. Virginia, since 2008, has really solidified itself as a blue state, except for two gubernatorial elections. since then with their one-term cycles. But there were some polling that came out over the last month or so with Trump within the margin of error of 3 points. I know there was a poll that was out yesterday that had her about 9 or 10 points up. Is Virginia a state to keep an eye on for election night where something could be up if the results don't come in early for her?
Sort of. I would say that a lot more 5 days ago. And it's not that things have changed that much in Virginia in 5 days. We just got more information. So we had some very low quality polling showing what you were saying, and it was really out of date. So higher quality polling that's more recent that came in the last few days, not like super high quality, but better. It's shown the race, clearly in Harris's direction. So I had Virginia as likely D. I didn't fully believe it, but you got to go for what the model tells you. Now it's to me 95% chance she wins. So I did include it in the ones that are like just on the edge to keep a little bit of an eye on.
Mm-hmm.
But and if you live in Virginia, yeah, do some knock on doors, talk to your friends, right? Get involved. But like it's it's sort of like the things go haywire pathway. If she really just has a Midwest or bust, performance, and the Southeast just goes is a disaster for her. And Virginia's like barely Southeast, but you know what I mean. It's really like Mid Atlantic.
Below the Mason
But
Dixon, right?
it's hard for her to lose Pennsylvania or to win Pennsylvania against Virginia. Um, I don't know. Sometimes you also look at the states that are a little different, and New Hampshire's kind of different from the ones that we're talking about that are in play. So maybe that's why they're investing. I'm surprised that they're investing dollars. So I didn't realize that. I just knew they did a stop.
So in terms of, I could be wrong that they were investing dollars. I know she made a stop there, but I don't want to spread anything spread anything fake. I have been keeping my eye on the gubernatorial race there because for whatever reason I get ads for it in Connecticut for the New Hampshire gubernatorial race. So regardless, so out of the 7 swings, which states at this point do you believe Harris would have the best chance of winning, and which of those states do you believe Trump would have the best chance of winning?
Yeah, I would say that Harris has had some really good polling in Michigan, and it's a state that what we saw in 2022 and in 2020 were good news, especially 2022. When I'm predicting what's going to happen in the next election, I look a lot more at the presidential, but the midterms factor in. And let me see, I'll get this number right so I can.
Yeah, while you're looking, what do you think separates Michigan from Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, if anything? Because there are usually in the last election there was a higher margin for Joe Biden in Michigan than I believe both Pennsylvania and Wisconsin.
Yeah, so here's what I would say with Michigan. In 2022, based off how it voted in House races, it looked like a state that was 4 points to the left of the popular vote, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is a really strong performance. Now, that doesn't guarantee that's going to happen the next presidential year, but sometimes that's an early signal that a state's moving in that trajectory, and it's part of what I include in my model. And given how strong the performance was there, it was much stronger in the governor races too. Um, and what we've seen in the polling in 2022, which also suggests Michigan is actually easier to win than the popular vote for Harris. That's a signal that's a little more in her direction. It's not like I would say it's safe. I'd say it's still D, but I think it's the state where she's looking at best. I would say Wisconsin is second. You don't have what I was just talking about with 2022. It was basically dead even relative to how the country voted in House races, which is also a good sign, but less meaningful. The polling there has been even better. So those are her 2 best looking states. But we're still talking about more than a 30% chance that it flips the other way. That's if you're watching, if you're thinking about politics all the time, that might not seem like much. If you're a sports fan, a team. If you've ever even watched an NBA game,
Mm-hmm.
a 3-point shooter shooting 1/3 of their baskets from 3 is solid. You're not surprised when they make that 1 out of 3. No one is like, how could this
Oh,
have happened?
that's a $15 to $20 million contract per year, right?
Yep. So that's why I'm working on my jump shot. We'll see if I get a little extra money on the side as a side hustle from Race to the White House.
All right. Well, it looks like, and I don't know if you would categorize this the same way. Obviously, for years, Pennsylvania was the white whale of the Republican Party. They got it in 2016. Now, once again, it's competitive again. It seems like George Bush, who won Nevada in 2004, I believe was the last time a GOP candidate on the presidential election won Nevada. Has Nevada become that white whale for Republicans once again? Because it seems like it's competitive every cycle, but the Democrats pull it out.
I would say white whale is actually a perfect metaphor because there's all these races that they should have won in one of these races, but they don't because Democrats win it by like this much all the time. But the reality is, Nevada has voted to the right of the popular vote in almost every single one of these elections, if not everyone, going back to at least 04. So I think the exception for I don't think Senate races are a good analogy for these things because there's too much relative to each state. But like 2022 Senate race was an exception. Democrats really did well there, even as they lost the national popular vote. But in these presidential races, right, like in theory, if the popular vote was closer, they could have lost it. And it is hard to tell there because the polling has seemed to always burn Republicans. Past misses aren't usually predictive of the future, but it's been kind of funny that even in races where Republicans have had like 4-point polling misses against them in every other state, they still seem to Nevada polling seems to never favor them or never like underrate
So,
them.
same question for Trump. What do you believe his best chances are of those 7 swing states?
Yeah, this is why Harris is the favorite. There's no state that Trump is in that he has as strong of an edge right now. There's states I think he's favored. Arizona, I gave him a 55% chance. Georgia, a 58% chance. North Carolina, 55% chance.
And where are you putting Pennsylvania right now? Are you putting that? Are you
55%, 56% chance for Dems. And as you can tell, this is why I say Harris isn't driving the car. She's in front, but like well, I guess she is driving the car, but the car is in like a high speed chase, right? She doesn't have a real lead here. That's significant. I definitely would rather be her. I'm very perplexed by Nate's model, to be honest. I find it hard to look at the numbers and say that Trump is ahead, but I absolutely see a case for him to be able to win and have an upset, and that wouldn't surprise me one bit. So none of these states has Trump really shifted significantly in his direction. All of his leads are genuinely like, I don't think he has more than a 56% chance in any of these swing states. Oh no, Georgia, 58% chance. That's his best state. That's not like that great. To be honest, though, when you're having like a 68% chance in Michigan, 67 for Harris, that's not exactly that great either. It's still pretty competitive. No one's really separating. You can hold on to it, right? It's one thing to get a boost after the debate. It's another thing to hold steady or to keep gaining.
And what do you make of the fact that it seems that this has been Trump's best polling in his 3 presidential races, and in the first 2, he overperformed his numbers. So do those metrics go into your modeling?
No, sort of, actually, in one specific way. So this is like the little extra part of my mouth I didn't talk as much about because I don't want to overwhelm you guys. But like, I also have to predict how likely there is to be a miss in each state. So there's signals that say an upset is more likely. If a state polling has been really, really off, actually, I look at like what my model, how far off my model's projection was for each state, and a lot of that is polling based. So if there's a bigger gap, I'm gonna be like, okay, Wisconsin more of a chance to miss here than average. A state where it's been really good, less of a chance to miss on average. So in that way, yeah, I'll have a higher chance of an upset in Wisconsin than I would otherwise. Um,
Hmm.
but it's not like you can assume the miss is going to happen in the same direction. I can't say that enough. Past misses are historically not predictive of the future. We all kind of think it was because 2016 and 2020 had the same directional miss, 2020 even more so. Maybe, just maybe, there's like this is possible, but I don't think it's probable that Trump specifically scrambles it so much and pollsters are just completely unable to figure out his non-college educated support. The reason why I don't think it's likely to at least be anything or I think it's more likely than not, it's not going to be anything like as severe, is because they're it's very obvious what the problem was. They've had a lot of
Hmm.
time to work on it.
Hmm. Well, as shout out to Harry Enton the other day on CNN, who said basically if you have a shift of basically 1 point, that could turn the entire race on its head.
Absolutely. That's why it's 55% is a toss up. You'd rather have the 55 than the 45. That can win. That can make I mean, that's someone that can win the division in baseball versus be out of the race since like August, right? That's not nothing. These gaps do matter, but it's not a lot.
All right. So speaking of more close races, let's shift to the Senate for a moment. So I'm looking at it. There's 3 races I have my eye on. I'm not including West Virginia because I think that's pretty much in
Take
the
it off the
bag
map.
for
Yeah,
the
you can take it
GOP.
off the map. It's if Democrats win that, they've won Missouri also. Like
Right.
we've had just the most insane polling miss maybe in
Right.
American history.
So I'm looking at Montana, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. I know if the GOP wins Montana, they're back into the majority. But John Tester has been historically strong. He had a very good showing in 2018. I know that was not a presidential year. There's been some polling saying that if the Montana voters were asked if that seat was the deciding seat in the Senate, that they would vote for Sheehy. Where do you see the Montana race as of today?
Yeah, I think that this is a very competitive race. The Tester is an underdog, but can absolutely win. I think the fundamentals of the race are a little stronger for Tester, based off how he did in the last election, based off his fundraising. That points to him being roughly tied. The polling shows him a little bit behind, right? And I think as a result, I give him a 42% chance. That's higher than most people, I'll acknowledge. But I look at a lot of candidate quality metrics beyond polling and, experience of the person running against. If you put a first time candidate, not always, but historically, they really underperform. And if you're getting out fundraised dramatically in terms of donations from actual people, leaving out PACs and self funding, it's a really big signal that maybe you're not running as good of a campaign.
And he's very well liked in Montana, John Tester.
So he has a shot, but I think he's an underdog.
Okay.
I would put a few more states on that list, though, right? I think Pennsylvania has been exceptionally strong for Democrats this race. Is it winnable for Republicans? Yeah, but they've won other races before that. It's my view, right? Like there's one CNN poll showing it tied, massive outlier, right? I think there's been like an 8 or 9% lead. So Casey may have taken it off. If we're going to election day, it doesn't look like it's on the map. It's not. It's on the map
And
because we're
Bob,
not on election day because things can
and
change.
Bob Casey is a known entity in Pennsylvania. His family is a known entity. He has a lot of institutional support. McCormick, you could argue, should have been the nominee or would have been a better nominee in
Yeah,
2022. Instead, it was Dr. Oz. So between Pennsylvania and Ohio in Sherrod Brown's race, which of those races do you give the edge to Democrats versus, or which one do you think looks better for Democrats? Which one do you think looks better for the Republicans?
Pennsylvania is Democrats have a huge edge right now. They could lose it, but it would be a major upset. Senate, if this were president, I mean, I have Casey on track to win by 7.6. This guy does like 15 points, 20 points better in some of these rural counties than presidential candidates have, right? Casey competes everywhere, and it really shows. And Democrats have come to this realization nationwide when they're running in Pennsylvania, but he came to the realization earlier that you compete everywhere, and that's how you win. So McCormick doesn't look like a particularly strong candidate. The guy has incredible credentials. I'm not taking that away from him. I mean, he's done some impressive things in his life. Under Secretary of Treasury for George W. Bush, CEO for a major company. But his time in Connecticut out of state, which has been a single part of his life, is hurting him way more post Dr. Oz than it probably would otherwise. And he's running against the absolute juggernaut of Pennsylvania politics right now, other than maybe Josh Shapiro.
I think McCormick would be the current Pennsylvania senator if he ended up the nominee in 2022.
That's very possible. I think Fetterman is a little bit like Trump in that folks that analyze politics tend to underrate him because his appeal is a lot more to relative to his performance otherwise, relative to other candidates. He does really well with non-college educated voters. And I think, between especially where his health was 2 years ago, it doesn't always make sense to analysts, but like he still managed to do pretty well. So I actually think Fetterman was an above average candidate last cycle. And Dr. Oz was a below average candidate. But I don't think it was just taking out Dr. Oz and you got it. He won by 5.5 points. I don't actually
Right.
personally think the gap between McCormick and Oz is 5.5. I think it exists, but I think he'd have a shot at winning. But I think Fetterman was tough to beat. And I think that was also a year where in certain states, Republicans were at a disadvantage relative to how they normally would do in a midterm. I think Pennsylvania was one of them due to abortion, among other things.
So in Ohio, Trump, I would imagine Trump is in the likely R in your
Oh,
model.
absolutely. He is a very good
So
candidate
what
there.
do you then make of the Senate race there in Sherrod Brown's reelection
Yeah,
campaign?
so that's a much bigger target for the GOP. I have it in the middle between Tilty and Tossick, right? So Brown has run a great race so far. He's led every single poll. He has a huge edge in fundraising. Now, again, this isn't a money spent, which is different, right? I can imagine a lot of people are cringing or yelling at me through the screen, and I get it. The actual money spent, that does matter. But That's a lot less predictive of the future because people spend money sometimes when the candidate's losing to make up for it. So you can't really say that's going to say they're going to overperform. It could be a signal they're doing weaker than expected. What you can say is the amount of money they're able to raise says you're running a good or bad campaign or you have good or bad capabilities for a candidate on average, right? And it is so extreme, the gap between there. When you combine that with the polling, how much he overperformed state Ohio Dems 6 years ago, there's some good signals for him. But it's a state that has clearly shifted to the right. Brown could easily lose it. It's just, if Democrats have an above average cycle, probably, and they win the White House, you got a pretty good chance the Ohio Senate race is going with it. If Trump wins, at that point, the GOP is overperforming projections, and then they're probably going to take Ohio. That's my guess.
How much tick? I mean, historically, Americans don't really ticket split, but it seems like that could be on the table. That there's more ticket splitting than historically what we've seen during this cycle. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, these trends don't continue forever, man. Eventually, they kind of even out on most things. I think we saw a comeback for ticket splitting in 2022, especially in races where voters felt strongly about for or against a candidate. Ohio, there's a massive gap in ticket splitting in both directions. So I think Sherrod Brown can still win. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to put some other states on the map here, right? If you don't mind,
Yeah,
let me talk
that's
about
what I
how I
was going
see
to
the
ask.
race.
So those are the three that I was looking at, and then so what other states are you looking at Senate wise that are competitive?
Well, let's just talk big picture first, right? So Democrats have 51 Senate races. Um, if Democrats win the White House, they need 50. If GOP wins the White House, they need 50, right? If GOP wins the White House, it's basically theirs, right? So let's focus more on if Harris wins the White House. Uh, she can only afford to lose one. She's already lost it, as you were saying earlier. West Virginia, Republicans got a great candidate there, Jim Justice, sorry,
Not the baseball
not the
player, David
baseball player.
Justice.
And he Manchin might have had a shot against Alex Mooney, but he doesn't against Justice. He was down by 10, so he didn't even run. Now it's like he's probably going to win by like over 30, maybe over 40 points. It's going to be a blowout. So Harris needs to either play perfect defense or pick up an extra seat. And on the defensive end, it's Ohio and Montana are front and center. Those are clearly the states they're going to pursue. Montana, they're a little favored. Ohio, they're underdogs, in my view, but not by much, right? This was where the race was earlier. They had so many options, which is why the GOP came in as much bigger favorites in the Senate than they are now. They had Arizona. Kari Lake's numbers have tanked after she tried to everything she could to get the 2022 election flipped. That really bugged voters out, and Dems have a strong candidate. He's leading in polls by a lot. It's not off the map, but it's close, right? You also had Michigan where it's more competitive, but Dems are really doing well. They're leading in the polls. She's on track to win by 7. There's a lot more chance of an upset, but it's still like that one is sort of like the stretch race. And there's a few others like that. Nevada, same thing. All these races have become 80% plus chance for Dems that were like 65, 75 early on.
Mm-hmm.
And what's interesting is on the other side, and this is why Democrats really do have a shot, even if Montana goes south. Texas and Florida have been more competitive, at least in my model, than all the states I just mentioned, outside of course, Montana and Ohio. Texas, we've had some polls showing Cruz only up by 2. He's leading every poll, so he's favored. Allred's been outstanding in fundraising. So you got like a 1 in 4 shot there. And in Florida, the polling's been even closer. Florida polling got us burned, so I understand having that with a grain of salt. But Rick Scott made the greatest political mistake I've seen in a long time, where in 2022, his big plan for the GOP, for some reason, was to say we should all campaign on every federal program ending every 2 years, which doesn't take much of a political strategist to realize that includes Medicare and Social Security. And it took him like 6 months to adjust, say, oh, I didn't mean that. And Democrats have been running ads around the clock since then, especially of late, pinning him on that. And they have a Democrat running who is, family came here for freedom from Venezuela. So she's a lot harder from a left wing authoritarian government. It's a lot harder to paint her as a communist trying to take away freedoms when her story is coming here to escape that. So she's an underdog too. Rick Scott won when Florida was, a lot more to the left than it is now, and in a Democrat blue wave. So you got to say he's favored still, but there's a shot there. These are 2 races Dems can win. And so if they lose Montana, which is very possible, they have a pathway where they're bigger underdogs in those 2 states, but they could pick one up. And the key to victory is options, just like in the presidential. You want multiple ways on the map. So if we see Florida and Texas move more in their direction, they have a shot. So I give the GOP, a 64, I think, percent chance at winning the Senate. They're definitely favored here because they have the easier path. But Democrats have managed to take an impossible math and created a pathway here. I wouldn't be surprised if they pulled it out.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
That's a great point. So moving on to the House. There's not a lot of polling at this point yet. for the House. I know as we get along with this election cycle, we're about 50 some odd days from the election, probably closer to October. We'll get a lot more House polling. Where do you see the House now? Do you see the House basically whatever winds are blowing of whoever wins the White House will probably take the House with them?
It's possible, but there seems to be a lot of split ticket voting in these races, and candidate quality measures a great deal in the House. I think Dems have a little better chance in the House than they do in the White House. I give them a 61% chance. We got basically they need to flip 4 seats, thanks to George Santos losing in that special election to win. But North Carolina has gerrymandered the heck out of, or GOP in North Carolina has gerrymandered the heck out of that state. So they need a few more to be able to pick up the victory now, right? And they have better opportunities than Republicans do to pick up. But both of these parties have areas where they're going to be aggressive. They're almost very likely both going to flip at least one seat, probably more than a few in that direction. If Democrats manage to have a decent cycle nationally and run really strong in New York and California, that's a target-rich environment there. Um, and this is a hard one to narrow down, right? Because I don't mean to over promote my own stuff, but if you go to the race to the White House on my house forecasts, I let you explore the House map and you can see region by region, like the key races. I think you almost need to do something like that to understand it because we're talking about 30 races or so that are in play here, right?
And there's a lot fewer toss ups than there used to be. Is that correct? After 2010 of the quote unquote shellacking, as President Obama used that term, that the Democrats took, it seems like there's a lot fewer toss up races than there used to be. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, I have a 13 straight down the middle toss ups. That's where neither party has a 65% chance to win. You got about an additional, let's see, 23, 14. You got like an additional 38 races or so that are possible for both parties to win 37, 38. That like that each party has at least like a 25% chance of winning. So
Mm.
I wouldn't say that there's nothing on the map. It's just harder than it.
Mm. All right. So right now, we're about, as I just said, we're about 50 something days away from the election. What is the best news for the Trump campaign? What is the best news for the Harris campaign as they move toward election day?
I would say the best news for the Trump campaign is the national polling is tight. He's done some wild things in the last month, and his polling after Harris had her surge and kind of plateaued, slight dip, like it doesn't really matter that much. Name matters a little bit, but like people like Trump give Trump the benefit of the doubt, and he's right in this in the national polling. If he has the same electoral map he had the last 2 cycles, and the polling stays on the national level, he's on track to win. Um, and we're going to see if that's true, right? But the other side for Harris is the absolutely historically bad 2020 electoral map and the gap between the popular vote that appears to be shrinking if the state polls are right, which is a big if. Uh, she has multiple pathways, so I would say it's like, yeah, it's not really about the popular vote. The way she's performing in North Carolina, how close it is in Georgia and Arizona, her edge in the Midwest, Mid Atlantic three are all good news for her. And I would say the best news for Harris on top of that is unquestionably the snap polls and the media coverage has been very strongly in her favor in the aftermath of this debate. Historically, that suggests she will gain. Every election since 2004 in my own mini debate polling model, which is hopefully all right because I literally built in 2 hours before I was talking to you here. Every single time, directionally, the person that won did gain some support. And her advantage in the snap election polls say she may gain 2%, and we'll see it. This has been an election where things don't seem to shift much, so maybe that won't end up being exactly right. But she's likely to gain a little bit, get some breathing room, and reverse her recent mini slide of the last week.
So, last question. What are you, obviously, a day in politics could feel like a week, and a week could feel like a year. And we don't know what's going to happen. Could there be some October surprise? Who knows? Probably. Beyond that, what are you looking at? What are you focusing on as we come in the final stretch of this race?
Yeah, I'd say the two things I like to look at the most are polling, the models, but that's my own, right? And other models too. But let's say polling and what voters are saying in focus groups if you want to really understand the electorate. Don't use focus groups to say, oh, 10 out of 15 people in this room said X. That's not representative. but you can get the why. I always think it's interesting to know the why. Frank Luntz does them, Sarah Longwell does them. There's some other groups that do them, and it's a really good way if you want to get an understanding of what are these swing voters actually thinking, what do they care about, and you can sometimes like see what's going to happen next because these are the things people are caring about. Then, as candidates fail or succeed to address them, as you have events that bring those things to higher relevance, as campaigns spend money making an issue more front and center in voters' minds, it can really cause shifts. They're doing the same type of thing to get a sense of what people care about. They're doing the same thing in the conversations that Harris is going to have with voters on the campaign trail and Trump's going to have with voters on the campaign trail. Yeah, so I like the two. I feel like that really helps you get a bit of a quantitative and a qualitative understanding of the electorate. And third, I'd say remember every single one of these, whether it's polling, especially individual polls, polling averages, and forecasts, these are all imperfect, foggy screenshots of what's going to happen. We're going to be wrong in some ways. Some ways we're probably going to be badly wrong, even in years where you nail it. Like my house forecast was, as you said, I got one off, but I also had a race that I gave Dems a 8% chance of winning or something like that they won in Washington third. There's going to be some places where we're just wildly off, where the data's not going to get there. So just keep in mind, things can change. We can be wrong. And hey, if you're caring a lot, don't just watch TV. Pick up a phone. Go online. Figure out where you can volunteer. Pick up a phone. Do some phone banking. Donate. You'll feel better versus just stressing out watching TV all the time.
Logan, I can't thank you enough. This has been fantastic. I hope we get to have you on again before November 5th. And always give me your self promotion. Let everybody know where they can find you.
Yeah. So best place to look is racetothewh.com. If you look at presidential predictions or forecasts, it'll be on Google, on the top first page, hopefully. And then on X, I'm Logan R2WH, Logan R2WH / Twitter. And I'm technically have a Facebook account for this stuff and Instagram, but those are social media platforms that like having pages is just really a lot less effective than it used to be as they changed um, the way their algorithms work. So it just doesn't make sense for me to keep it updated with all the work I have to do with running the site. So I've kind of left behind on those, but you can probably find them and laugh at how out of date I am on there.
All right, Logan. Thank you again, and I hope we're in touch.
Yeah, more than happy to come back, Clifford. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thanks for having